Hello, dear friends, and welcome to part 5 of this softly spoken read-through of British kings and queens, from the Anglo-Saxons to the House of Windsor. A lovely book that gives us a detailed biography, a mini-biography of every single ruler of Britain. And we start our part here, having followed on from the Tudor age, to now exploring the reign of James I, who of course was also James VI of Scotland. We had many Jameses in Scotland first. So the House of Stuart started with the reign being 1603 to 1625 in England, but actually started many years before in Scotland in 1567. So the first of the Stuart kings was born in Edinburgh Castle, the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, and Lord Darnley, who was murdered within a year of his birth. Tragic. Queen Elizabeth was his godmother. Catholic Mary, the Queen of Scots, was implicated in the murder of his father, and her Protestant enemies used this suspicion to force her to abdicate in favour of her 13-month-old son James. That's a very young age to be abdicated to. He was brought up as a member of the Protestant Church of Scotland, never saw his mother again. So throughout his young age, James was left to care of various regions as Scotland survived the threat of civil war caused by religious differences. So the official religion of Scotland at the time was Presbyterianism, and Roman Catholicism was suppressed. James actively became King of Scotland in 1581 and claimed the crown of England and Wales through Henry VII's daughter, Margaret, who was his great-grandmother, and the Treaty of Berwick, which both he and Elizabeth I signed in 1586. This pledged allegiance, non-aggression, and mutual help against invasion. So as mentioned before, he'd been King of Scotland for 36 years before becoming King of England, and had for some time been in secret contact with Elizabeth's most trusted advisor, Robert Cecil, agreeing on various details for the coming reign. So when Elizabeth died, James was immediately proclaimed king in England and Scotland, and James moved south to London, where he was received with great enthusiasm, because everyone was relieved after years of worry that the empty throne would trigger civil war again. So here we have an engraving of James I and VI of Scotland and his consort Anne of Denmark. Here are some coins from the reign of King James I, and a Flemish portrait of James. Here are some more lovely portraits. Here's a portrait at the Palazzo Pitti Florence by Alfredo Dagliotti. So even more than Elizabeth, James believed in the divine right of kings and his right to behave as an absolute monarch. So he did not have much regard for parliaments. So it wasn't long before James was viewed with enormous suspicion, not just because he was a foreigner. The Gunpowder Plot of 1605 was only on one of many attempts on the life of King James. So the would-be assassins were prepared to blow up the full session of Parliament along with the king, and they were betrayed and ultimately met a horrible death, celebrated annually ever since, mandatory until 1859. So if you're not familiar about this, or are familiar with this aspect of English history, on the 5th of November every year we have Bonfire Night. I suppose it's a little bit like the July 4th celebrations. And Bonfire Night is a celebration of the failed attempt of this assassination. And you have a guy, known as Guy, well, based on Guy Fawkes, who was the main perpetrator caught in this assassination plot. And people dress up the guy in whatever way they want, usually made out of hay or straw. and then they're put on a bonfire to be burnt. It's an interesting celebration. If you think about it, it's the celebration of... it's a bit different to the celebration of many other countries which often celebrate freedom or liberty, where actually this is about celebrating the suppression of the removal of monarchy. So it's quite a bit different culturally, actually, to other firework celebrations of its kind globally. So James's personal aim was to establish the union of the crowns of England and Scotland, one monarch, one parliament, one law. This wasn't popular on either side of the border, but one of his greatest achievements was to commission a new version of the Bible, which of course is known the world over, the King James Bible. It's the standard text for over 250 years. And in 1589, James married Anne of Denmark, and together they had 9 children, but unfortunately only 3 survived childhood. His son and heir, Henry, died probably from typhoid in 1612, throwing James into prolonged and deep depression, made only worse by the death of his wife Anne in 1619. He died at age 58 in March 1625 and was buried at Westminster Abbey. Here is James I wearing the chivalric Order of the Garter, which bears the inscription, Honi soit cum mali pense, evil to be him who evil thinks. We now move on to the famous Rail of Charles I. Here is an engraving by Robert Peake. So he's the second son of James. He was born in Dunfermline Palace in Fife, 1600, November 1600, and became the heir to the crowns of England and Scotland on the death of his older brother Henry in 1612. James I became senile in his final years. Charles and his father's favourite, George Villiers, Duke of Buckingham, effectively ruled in his place. So Charles became king on the death of his father in 1625, and 3 months later, despite all popular and parliamentary advice to the contrary, he married Henrietta Maria of France, who was the sister of Louis XIII. They produced 6 children who lived beyond infants, and here is Charles I and his second son James, Duke of York, later James II, in 1647. Charles I, here the only British monarch to have been deposed and executed by Parliament. So Charles was crowned at Westminster Abbey in February 1626. He believed in the divine right of kings like his father, but unlike him, Charles would neither compromise or listen to the opinions of others. He's reported to have said, "Kings are not bound to give an account of their actions, but to God alone." Bit of a recipe for disaster. And Charles was deeply religious. He followed a high Anglican form of worship. Henry Maria was a Catholic. Both of them made people uneasy and suspicious, especially in Puritan Scotland, and increasingly so in England. His court was highly cultivated and extravagant. The arts were celebrated, and the royal picture collection greatly increased, racking up the crown debts. But this is where we start to see this wonderful style of classic painting coming in. Religion and foreign policy dominated the reign, and the conflict between the king's right to rule as opposed to Parliament's authority. The 30 Years' War, which was a bitter conflict between Catholic and Protestant countries, was raging across Western Europe. Charles wanted to intervene against Spain, but Parliament wouldn't fund sufficient money. The incompetent Buckingham went to war anyway, while Charles attempted to levy taxes without parliamentary consent. Buckingham was assassinated in 1628 while under impeachment, and the war against Spain effectively ended. 1629 saw the start of the 11 Years' Tyranny, the ultimate exercise of absolute authority, when Charles I ruled without Parliament, using ancient and obsolete laws and precedents to raise revenue. In 1639, the First Bishops' War broke out in Scotland as Charles attempted to enforce the use of a more Anglican prayer book, but he was forced into a humiliating truce at the Treaty of Ripon that precipitated a financial and military crisis and made the recall of Parliament necessary in April 1640 and ended the reign of personal rule. So So Charles was given no choice but to revoke a number of assumed powers, but conflicts over money, foreign wars, religion, this all continued. Civil war became inevitable. So Charles fled to Oxford, set up his court and government over northwest and southwest England. Parliament controlled London, the south, East Anglia, the army, and crucially, the navy. Civil war started officially at the Battle of Edgehill in October 1642. Battles ebbed and flowed until Charles fled to Scotland, but after 9 months, the Presbyterians gave him back to the English parliamentarians. In 1647, he was imprisoned. In July 1648, the Second Civil War opened at Charles' instigation when the Royalists started uprisings around the country. Wales rebelled, Scotland invaded. However, the parliamentarians have successfully put down the rebellions, and in 1649 the Rump Parliament passed an act to try Charles for high treason. Charles refused to acknowledge the authority of the court, but was found guilty, and 59 commissioners signed his death warrant in January 1649. 3 days later, he was publicly beheaded in front of the banqueting hall in Whitehall on January the 30th, 1649. His head was sewn back onto his body, which was buried at Windsor Castle. And on February the 7th, 1649, the position of king was formally abolished. So, of course, we now meet quite a big moment in monarchy, where the actions of Charles I had led to the rise of Oliver Cromwell, the Roundheads and the parliamentarians, led to a civil war that effectively ended the monarchy in England and Britain for a time. And by all accounts, it was a quite austere period. You hear all kinds of things like Christmas being cancelled, and a very puritanical reign established, or government established. But Charles II came back to reign in 1660 to 1685. So the reign of Charles II followed the Interregnum, the period when the first Oliver and then Richard Cromwell governed England. So in Edinburgh, a little over a month after his father's execution, on February the 5th, 1649, the Scottish Parliament declared Charles King of Scotland, and he was crowned on the January the 1st, 1651. He had to accept certain conditions, namely introduce, support and guarantee Presbyterian church governance over Britain, as signed in the Solemn League and Covenant. This won him the crown in Scotland, but lost him support in England. He and his largely Scottish royalist army moved south into England, where they met Cromwell's forces at the Battle of Worcester in September 1651. The invaders were defeated, and after 6 weeks of near capture, including hiding in an oak tree, Charles escaped to Normandy, and Oliver Cromwell became Lord Protector of England. Now, what my family coat of arms includes an oak tree. I've been told that this is apparently due to the fact that my family assisted Charles II in hiding within this oak tree. Whether or not that is to be believed, and whether or not countless families across this country bear a similar story, which is all the more likely, remains to be seen. But here is a contemporary mezzotint of Charles II. And here he is wearing the robes of the Order of the Garter. So Charles remained in exile for 9 years. In 1658, Cromwell died and was succeeded by his son Richard, but he only lasted a year, and the Protectorate was abolished. The new Convention Parliament, despite attempts at packing it, turned out to be almost equally divided between royalists and parliamentarians. So hearing of the Declaration of Breda, in which Charles laid out his conditions for accepting the English throne, and crucially his intention to pardon most of his father's enemies, Charles was invited to take the throne. He arrived back in England and entered London on May 29, 1660, his 30th birthday. On April 23rd at Westminster Abbey, Charles II was crowned King of England and Ireland, and this period became known as the Restoration. Charles and Parliament granted amnesty to Cromwell's supporters, with the exception of 50 people who were tried. Some were excluded from office, some got life imprisonment, 9 regicides were executed. Oliver Cromwell's body was removed from Westminster Abbey. His body hung in chains at Tyburn, and his severed head displayed on a pole outside Westminster Abbey for 24 years. Wow. The new Cavalier Parliament passed a series of acts that together became known as the Clarendon Code. It's enacting a number of anti-Puritan laws, re-established the position and influence of the Church of England. In 1662, Charles married Catherine of Braganza, a Portuguese Roman Catholic princess, which brought a dowry that included the important trading port cities of Tangier and Bombay. It's amazing, isn't it, that a wedding dowry brings with it straight-up cities. They didn't have children together, but Charles, of course, notoriously had numerous mistresses, including a very famous one, Nell Gwynn, a famous actress, and 12 illegitimate children. So in the late summer and fall, it was all kicking off in London and in England. In 1665, the Great Plague of London killed up to 100,000 people, a fifth of the population. Anyone with money, including the king and his court, fled to the country. Charles moved to Salisbury and Parliament to Oxford. The plague ended in the flames of the Great Fire of London in September 1666, which even St. Paul's Cathedral was consumed by. By 1669, it was obvious that the unfortunate Queen could not produce a living baby. Charles refused to remarry, so the heir presumptive became James, Duke of York, Charles's unpopular Catholic brother. To make this acceptable, it was agreed that James's daughter Mary would marry the Protestant William of Orange. Personally, Charles favoured appeasement and compromise when it came to religion, but was thwarted by Parliament in 1672 when he tried to introduce religious freedom with the Royal Declaration of Indulgence. What a name, what a title. I think we could all get behind the Royal Declaration of Indulgence. Religion was still the prime motivator for domestic and foreign policy. This was reflected on the world stage as other European countries struggled to reach their own accord within their borders and their neighbours. A couple of great images here. Charles II became known as the Merry Monarch, a big advocate of the arts. From the 1650s, England and the Dutch were involved in a series of wars as the English tried to subvert and claim Dutch markets and sources of world trade. One consequence was the English capture of the Dutch settlement of New Amsterdam, which they renamed New York, after James, Duke of York, Charles's brother. Alliances changed with the times, but all wars cost money, which Parliament was reluctant to concede. This forced Charles to make peace in 1674. In 1679, Titus Oates announced the existence of a popish plot and a Roman Catholic scheme to assassinate the king, which provoked anti-Catholic hysteria and the Exclusion Bill, by which Parliament tried to remove James, Duke of York, from the line of succession. In response, rival sides emerged: the pro-exclusion Whig Party and the anti-exclusion Tory Party, to which Charles allied himself. Following the exclusion crisis, Charles dissolved his final parliament in 1679 and ruled by himself until his death. He died in February 1685 following an apoplectic fit, aged 54. He converted to Catholicism on his deathbed and was buried at Westminster Abbey. He was then followed by James II, the third son of Charles I, and Henrietta Maria of France. Spent his youth in exile in Paris and France, and served in the French army until changing to fight with the Spanish. From the start, James's love life was complicated. He had many lovers, fathered many children, and against all advice in 1660 he secretly married Anne Hyde, a commoner who was carrying his child. Over the years they lost numerous children. Only 2 daughters survived to adulthood. And his wife remained devoted despite James's numerous mistresses. In about 1668, James and Anne secretly converted to Catholicism and died in 1671. So James became his brother's Lord High Admiral, a lucrative and important post, commanded the Royal Navy in action against the Dutch. In 1673, he gave up the post, and he was required to swear the Test Act, basically accepting the Church of England, and his conversion to Catholicism became generally known. In 1673, he married for the second time. His bride was the 15-year-old Mary of Modena, an Italian Catholic princess. They had 2 sons and 5 daughters. By the 1670s, it was apparent that James was Charles' successor. Under temper fierce, James finally consented to his daughter Mary's marriage to his nephew, Prince of Orange, William. Charles II died, as we know, in 1685, which made James II King of England, and James VII of Scotland, aged 51. He was crowned at Westminster Abbey in April 1685, retained most of Charles' advisers and officers, and immediately called Parliament, but soon faced a double-pronged rebellion from his nephew, the Duke of Monmouth in the south of England, and the Earl of Argyll in Scotland, both funded by the Netherlands. Here is James II's mausoleum in the Église de Saint-Germain in France. Both rebellions failed. Both leaders were executed, and across the west of England a series of treason trails known as the Bloody Assizes meted out rough justice to the rebels. The upshot of the rebellions was that James created a large standing army and was attempting to introduce religious equality laws. Parliament objected to his use of Catholic commanders and was dismissed, never to be recalled in James II's reign. In 1687, James issued the Declaration of Indulgence in an attempt to promote religious tolerance of Catholics and nonconformists, but this had the effect of escalating religious tension. He continued to promote Catholics to high office in government, the military, educational institutions, but trouble escalated when he fathered a Catholic son, James Francis Edward Stuart. On June the 10th, 1688, on June 30, a group of Protestant nobles, later known as the Immortal Seven, invited William of Orange to invade England and take the throne. William arrived in November, and crucially the army and navy, as well as a number of nobles, swapped allegiance to join him. By December, James had lost so much ground that he attempted to flee to France, captured in Kent before being allowed to escape to refuge with his cousin Louis XIV, who gave him a palace at Saint-Germain-en-Laye and a pension. Parliament decided that James had abdicated by fleeing, and by dropping the Great Seal of the realm into the Thames, they declared his daughter Mary Queen and her husband William King. They also declared that from then on, no Catholic could ascend the throne, nor any member of the royal family marry one, which is a ruling that still applies today. I didn't realise that. James attempted to retake the throne with a French army in Ireland, but lost heavily at the Battle of the Boyne in 1690, died in 1701 at Saint-Germain-en-Laye, and was buried in Paris. Here we have William III and Mary II. Here is a painting of William, Prince of Orange, as a boy. And that is such an incredibly romantic painting, isn't it? Unbelievably romantic. So Mary was the daughter of James II and his first wife. And as we know, Mary was betrothed against her father's wishes to her first cousin, the Protestant William, Prince of Orange, who was born in The Hague. He was the posthumous son of William II of Nassau and Mary Stuart, the eldest daughter of Charles I. So by the age of 9, he was an orphan. They married in 1677 in London when William was 27 and Mary 15, and moved to the Netherlands to live. To Mary's enduring sorrow, their union was childless. In 1688, he was formally asked in secret by the Immortal Seven to invade England with his army, where he would be greeted by a spontaneous popular uprising that would put the pair of them on the throne. So the crown was only offered to Mary, but William refused to cooperate until he was given parity with her. The army landed in Torbay in November 5th and was quickly joined by the English navy and army. When James fled to France, Parliament declared him to have abdicated, so they offered the crown to both of them. So they were crowned in Westminster Abbey on the 11th of April 1689, and the same day were offered the Scottish crown, and on all this became known as the Glorious Revolution. In 1689, the Bill of Rights was passed by Parliament, which greatly limited the powers of the sovereign, many of which can only be used through and with the consent of Parliament. So moreover from then, the sovereign was financially dependent on Parliament. So this is where we start to see a big shift to the monarchy as it is today. From 1690, Mary administered the government as William fought abroad, initially against the Jacobites in Ireland, and then against French expansionism in the Netherlands. She died of smallpox, aged 32, in December 1694 at Kensington Palace, and was buried at Westminster Abbey. William continued to rule alone, but wasn't popular, especially with regards to his Dutch advisors. Without an heir, Parliament passed the Act of Settlement to ensure the Protestant succession. Anne was the next in line, but only had one sickly child, despite 17 pregnancies, so the honour passed to Sophia, the Electress of Hanover. William III died in 1702 of pneumonia after falling off his horse and breaking his collarbone at Hampton Court, and the throne passed to Mary's sister Anne. He was buried in Westminster Abbey beside Mary. This just goes to show how young they were. Look at that. William III and his wife Mary. And above here, coinage from the reign of William and Mary. And a statue of them outside Kensington Palace. Really does put it into perspective when you see paintings of them of this age, where they're essentially being told, you should invade England. And, this is their age. Invade England, kids. We now have Anne, who reigned from 1702 to 1714. So like her sister Mary II, Anne was born at St. James's Palace, London, the daughter of James II and his first wife, Anne Hyde, and was raised as an Anglican. In July 1683, Anne married George, Prince of Denmark, and between 1683 and 1700 had around 18 pregnancies, but only one son survived infancy. That is terrible. The emotional, physical, mental toil on somebody. Terrible. William, Duke of Gloucester, was the son who survived. He died aged 11 in 1700, and a succession crisis became apparent, as the next heir was either the exiled James II or his son, James Stuart. So the Act of Settlement was hastily enacted, securing the Protestant succession. Anne succeeded her sister Mary and brother-in-law William of Orange to the throne in March 1702 because they had no direct heirs, becoming in the process the last of the Stuart kings. Within months, the War of the Spanish Succession started, with England taking the side of Archduke Charles as the heir to the Spanish throne. The war and its consequences dominated England's foreign and domestic policy for almost her entire reign. Anne made her husband George Lord High Admiral, put him in charge of the Royal Navy, and gave Lord Marlborough control of the army. Political affiliations came to the fore during Anne's reign. The Tories supported strong monarchy and the Anglican Church of England, while the Whigs spoke for limited monarchy and religious dissenters. In the matter of the succession, England and Scotland diverged. The English Parliament declared the crown should go to the nearest royal Protestant relative, Sophia, Electress of Hanover, while the Scots on the whole preferred the exiled Catholic James Stuart. On May the 1st, 1707, after months of angry argument, the two parliaments signed the Acts of Union 1707, creating the Kingdom of Great Britain, and merged as one parliament sitting in Westminster, London. They also shared a common coinage and flag. How other religion was accepted, Scotland would retain the Church of Scotland, plus its own legal and educational systems. Broadly, the same demarcations remain today. Separately, Anne was Queen of Ireland. In 1708, Prince George of Denmark died at Windsor, leaving Anne desolate, but the Whigs delighted. A struggle for power and precedence followed as the Whigs tried to gain control of government with the active help of the Duchess of Marlborough guiding the grieving Queen. Here is the statue of her outside St. Paul's Cathedral, and here is Anne in her ermine-trimmed coronation robes. Queen Anne had been dominated for 20 years or so by this strong-minded friend, Sarah Jennings Churchill. They had met as children in 1673, whose husband John Churchill became the Duke of Marlborough and a national hero for his military victories at Blenheim, Ramillies and Oudenarde and Malplaquet. It was Sarah who got Anne to support William of Orange rather than her father James II in 1688. Always anxious to promote her Whig friends, Sarah eventually went too far and was dismissed along with her husband from favour and court. The War of Spanish Succession continued, with ever-mounting costs and consequent unpopularity for it and the Whig party. The general election of 1710 returned a Tory majority, and they initially attempted to reach a peace before events changed their minds. With the arguments raging, Anne created 12 new peers to outnumber the Tory majority in the House of Lords that won the majority vote for peace and ended Britain's involvement in foreign war. Anne died from a side effect of gout in August 1714 and was buried in Westminster Abbey. Thanks to the Act of Settlement, her successor was George Ludwig, Elector of Hanover, Sophia's son, rather than any of the 56 Catholic successors who had a much stronger claim. And this takes us over to the reign of the Hanovers. So I think that is a good place to put a pin in it and return to at a later part. So thank you for joining me of this wonderful read-through of the Stuart line of monarchs. I look forward to having you join me next time. But until then, goodbye.